Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome from rainy Mexico City today to our today's webinar, which is called Preparing for USMCA, Technical and Practical Implications of the New Trade Agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada. My name is Thomas Moschig, and I'm the Commercial Attaché here in Mexico City, and it is my utmost pleasure to guide you through our today's virtual event. NAFTA soon will be history. The future will be called USMCA, as you know. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement will enter into effect in a bit more than a week from now, and will expire no later than in 2036. However, there is also a transition time or an implementation time to give the economy the chance to adapt to the implications of this agreement. Though similarities exist between NAFTA and USMCA, it is important to be aware of the differences, in addition to the potential financial and regulatory impacts on your supply chain. And this is why our offices from the US, from Canada, and from ourselves in Mexico here teamed up to provide you with up-to-date information on the actual situation. And therefore, before starting right away, my special thanks go out obviously not just to our speakers of today, whom I will introduce in just a minute, but also to my other North American colleagues, as well as to their teams who had heavily contributed to make today's event possible, which is from Advantage Austria in Chicago, Trade Commissioner Peter Sedelmeier, from Advantage Austria Toronto, Consul and Trade Commissioner Christian Lasnik, and from Advantage Austria Washington, Commercial Attaché Andreas Stauber. Together, we did our best to organize a webinar with the most interesting experts for you in order to give you a profound insight into this very, very complex topic. And with that having said, we hope that you find this webinar today very informative and useful. At the end of this webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions directly to the experts. Simply type your question during the webinar or after the presentations into the chat box, and we will try our best to answer all of your questions. Unfortunately, our time is limited today, so we might not answer all the questions, but be sure that we get back to you with our experts and answer your questions anyway. If not during the webinar, then afterwards. But let's jump right into this topic because there's a lot we have to tell you today. Without doubt, there are many, many perspectives of this USMCA to look at from. What is interesting for us as Advantage Austria, as the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, though, is obviously the perspective of the Austrian enterprises and its subsidiaries in North America. And this is why we invited top experts who will spend the next 45 minutes on going more into detail, into technical details of this trade agreement, relevant for the Austrian business society always, of course. So this is why I'm very happy to announce the following speakers of today. Firstly, we will start with a recapitulation of NAFTA and the legal background check of the USMCA. This part will be presented by gentlemen Cervantes and Valencia from Galicia Abogados. Secondly, we will listen to Gianluca Romano from MIC Custom Solutions, who knows the automotive industry in North America like his back garden. He will give us the insight into the interface between suppliers and OEMs in North America. And thirdly, we invited, and I'm glad he joined, Mr. Dr. Demmelbauer-Ebner. He is the Chief Engineering Officer from Volkswagen USA, and he will provide us insights on how European OEMs in North America are preparing for these changes and how Volkswagen sees arising challenges right now. With that having said, I would like to start, and I'm excited to introduce you to Mr. Juan Pablo Cervantes and Mario Valencia from the law firm Galicia Abogados. These gentlemen are very familiar with this topic as the firm was involved into the USMCA negotiations itself. Mr. Pablo Cervantes is counsel of Galicia Abogados and is specialized, among others, in international trade and general corporate matters. He's also president of the Mexico-United States Bilateral Committee, and is member of various North American, European, Asian business and investment associations. And one word to Mario Valencia. He is partner of Galicia Abogados since 2020 and head of Customs and International Trade Group of the firm. His work is focused, among others, on advising national and international clients in trade-related topics, tax and customs planning, negotiation and application of free trade agreements, and many more. So I'm not going to waste more of your time. I think we have a very tight schedule today, and thank you, Mr. Cervantes, for joining us today. Also, Mr. Valencia, I would like to ask you to start your presentation part.
Good morning, everyone. Thomas, thank you very much. I would like to begin by giving thanks to the Austrian Embassy in Mexico, as well as to Advantage Austria for their kind invitation to share some thoughts with you regarding TMEC, or USMCA, or what is until now known as NAFTA. As Thomas was saying, my name is Juan Pablo Cervantes. I'm counsel at Galicia Abogados. Galicia Abogados is a multidisciplinary law firm founded 25 years ago with offices in Monterrey and Mexico City, our main office. And with over 200 attorneys, we have been consistently ranked as one of Mexico's leading firms. Regarding USMCA, I'd like to begin with some background. The North American Free Trade Agreement that you're all familiar with was begun in 1994. NAFTA, as you know, was one of the most innovative commercial agreements of the 20th century, and it also became a reference to multiple treaties executed worldwide. As for the objectives of NAFTA, these objectives had to do first with eliminate trade obstacles, facilitate cross-border trade of goods and services within the three countries, and last, increase investment opportunities in the three member countries. These objectives were amply and successfully met by the three countries, as NAFTA became a very, very important free trade agreement for the whole region. As for the evolution of trade, I would like to share with you some data. And to begin with, in 1993, NAFTA was at around $300 billion, the trade between the three countries, certainly not a small amount. But of course, if you take a look at 2017, this amount became $1.3 trillion. So this, of course, will give you an idea on the importance of NAFTA for the three countries and the region as itself. Regarding certain data on the evolution of commerce within the NAFTA region, trade between the three NAFTA partners is much larger than that between the 28 EU countries and almost double than that with China. 46 out of the 50 states of the United States have Mexico and Canada as their first or second commercial partners, which became very relevant. As you may recall, during the renegotiation, there was much participation from US, Canadian, and Mexico governors. As for trade with Mexico, it grew 6 times, reaching $616 billion, and this translates to an important amount, which is over $1 million per minute. So again, this helps to exemplify the importance of the trade between the region. Regarding sales by Mexico, and as you may be aware, Mexico sells 80% of its exports to the United States. This created a deficit throughout the last 25 years, and this $70 billion deficit was important because it was one of the main reasons that the US administration put forward for the renegotiation process. Regarding the renegotiation itself, as you may recall, in November of 2016, President Trump took office in the United States, and the first thing that he did as a president was to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you may also recall, during his campaign, he was very vocal against NAFTA, saying that it was the worst trade deal ever, and that as soon as he became president, he would renegotiate or pull out. So in May of 2017, he notified Congress the intention of beginning negotiations with Canada and Mexico. And the main objectives were first, the reduction of deficit, which I spoke about a minute ago, additional of a digital economy chapter, which is very important and which we will look into in a minute, and then incorporation and strengthening of labor and environmental related obligations, which we will also discuss shortly. There were multiple negotiation rounds held in the US, Mexico, and Canada, and this ended on November 30th, 2018, with the signature of NAFTA in the midst of a G20 group in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, as for the new treaty, I would very briefly like to give you some idea on what the changes are. To begin with, it has 12 new chapters vis-a-vis NAFTA, some of the most relevant ones being labor, which we'll discuss shortly, the environment, customs administration, IP, e-commerce, and anti-corruption. Just to give you an idea as well, I'd like to touch on labor, for example. As you may recall, in Mexico, for the last year and a half, we have had very important updating of our labor legal system in order, of course, to meet and to address the USMCA labor-related obligations. Now, as you may also recall, at the end of last year, and while NAFTA had already been signed, it still needed ratification by the US Congress. In order to obtain authorization, particularly from the Democrats, there was a very intense push for undertaking labor reforms into the NAFTA or into the USMCA, forgive me, that would address certain inconsistencies. With such, they agreed, or the Democrats agreed for their ratification, which took place in December of last year, and there were a number of labor-related obligations that were put in place in a specific protocol. Just to give you a very quick idea, there is a rapid response labor mechanism, which is a novel mechanism for addressing labor-related violations in the three countries, particularly in Mexico. And this would provide an opportunity or the right for Canada or for the US to file a claim against Mexico in case for alleged violations of the rights of freedom of association and rights to collective agreement. There have been more labor-related issues as well addressing to the USMCA, but this might give you an idea on the importance of this chapter. Another novel aspect has to do with the environment. Environment was important 25 years ago, but it has become much more important nowadays. So there are some specific environmental related obligations for the three parties in the new agreement. There are also certain novel issues regarding anti-corruption and compliance with property programs. This is a new chapter, and these obligations are very much in line with OECD Convention of Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in the International Business Transaction. So with this, I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Mario Valencia. Mario, the mic is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this webinar. I will like to thank all of the organizers for thinking of us, and I will try to cover the last two important aspects of the general overview that Juan Pablo started to give you about what the new USMCA will give to us and the world, and then I will try to touch on some particular aspects that we consider relevant on what's going to happen after July 1st. So just to conclude this introduction regarding intellectual property rights, I will try to cover this pretty briefly, since it basically extended the period of time that the property rights will be covered under NAFTA, particularly for chemical products and for some pharma products. So basically what it's doing, it's just extending the period that these rights will be covered when you are when they are duly registered with the respective authorities of the country. For example, chemical products went up to 10 years. Pharma products, it's 5 years as of the date of authorization. There are another 10 years of biological products for pharma industry, etc. For e-commerce, it basically stated or brought to the new treaty some personal information that was already stated in the OECD, and also some basically what it tried to do was to establish a background for protection for the consumers and for the information that is shared through these online platforms. As you might be aware, commerce through international means in Mexico has been developing and increasing significantly. So this chapter is going to be relevant for our industry and how things are going to play out in the future. With that, we concluded the general overview, and now we would like to touch on specific points about what's going to happen as of July 1st when the new treaty comes into force. As you are aware, because I'm sure all over the world we've been listening to the modifications of the rules of origin, particularly in the auto industry, since it's going to be the most important changes. But as you know, right now, as of this new treaty, we won't have a particular format or form that we will have to fill out to certify the origin of goods. As it will happen with NAFTA, you have, even though it wasn't a hard document that needed to be certified or validated by the customs authority of the countries, it was a specific form or format that we had to fill out with a specific or particular information. As of the USMCA, that form is no longer valid, and you can even do electronic certifications. And these certifications are going to be, which is an important change, can be made now by the producers and exporters, as it used to be with NAFTA. But now the importers can also certify the goods as originated from NAFTA. However, this certification of origin won't be valid using the knowledge of goods as it used to happen with NAFTA. You have to have hard evidence that the goods actually comply with the rules of origin as stated in the USMCA. For most of them, they are similar or basically the same as they used to be with NAFTA. We're gonna touch on the specific industries that have been modified, and especially the auto industry, since it was the most relevant modification. So now you have a better or more detailed regulation on how the verification procedures are going to be carried on by each customs authority of the countries, and how they have to be followed and how they are going to become valid when a resolution is issued after this verification process. Of course, some industries were specifically modified and the changes are relevant. In the auto sector, which is the most important, or at least the most, the one that was modified the hardest, it is two basic principles. The first one is that now we have a specific rule of origin, including the value content that the main parts have to have, but also a significant value content of the whole non-originated parts that can be incorporated to that final good. The first one, it's related to the steel and aluminum, which has to set at least 70% of the total value, but that will take place up to between 7 and 10 years, depending on aluminum or steel. And also, as a general idea or a general concept, the full regional content has to be up to 75% with the new USMCA. This means that before we used to have 62.5%, and that means that all of the non-originated materials couldn't be above that threshold, that 37.5. Now you only have room to have 25% of that regional content not coming from the regional the NAFTA region, now the USMCA region. And even more, from that 75%, 45% has to come from places or regions within the USMCA region that have at least $60 per hour as a minimum wage, which is a really significant modification, especially for Mexico, because of what Juan Pablo was saying, which is Mexico became a relevant hub for receiving investment for manufacturing industries because of that lower wages or cheap labor, to say it in a matter of speed. I think I'm gonna cover the rules of origin for the automotive sector pretty quickly, because my colleagues are also gonna touch on this. The most relevant are, as we were saying, that the steel and aluminum have to value or be of a value of 70% of the region. So only 30% can come from outside the USMCA region. The labor value content, as we just said, 40% has to come from regions offering 16% per hour wages. There is a specific regulation included in parallel letters that there can be no restrictions for exports of auto parts or automobiles between the region, and this was an important lobby effort by Canada and Mexico with the negotiation of the USMCA. Therefore, I would like to also touch on the fact that on June 3rd, the regulations, or the uniform regulation for the USMCA, were issued, and they cover four main aspects: rules of origin, origin procedures, textiles and apparel, and trade facilitation. These are basically a specific regulation that give greater detail on what the rules of origin will look like, what the origin procedures will look like, specific comments on textile and apparels, and how the trade facilitation will look like when we apply or when we are using the USMCA officially. And they basically translated what the USMCA text, official text, has into a specific or greater detail that we can look at when you are actually applying the USMCA. The most relevant ones are what the origin procedures would look like, the specific content that you will have to have in the order by the customs authority of each country when they want to verify the origin of an exporter, and also that when a resolution is issued within this procedure, they will apply only for products after the resolution is issued. And regarding trade facilitation, that all of the regulations or resolutions issued by the countries related to tariff classification, origin of goods, specific aspects of rules of origin, they have to be made public, so everyone can actually know their content and know what they will look like. With this, I think, Thomas, I will finish my presentation and give you the microphone again.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting introduction and the detailed insight into this matter. I know it's very difficult to put such a complex topic in a compact format of 15 minutes. And to the audience, I assure you that whenever you have detailed questions regarding the legal background, we will try to answer them at the end of this section or after this webinar. So don't worry, no questions will be unanswered, even though we have just little time. But without any further delay, I would like to continue with the practical aspects now from a supplier's perspective. And with over 20 years in trade compliance industry, our next speaker, Gianluca Romano, has held senior positions in accountancy, global import and custom service companies throughout his career. He has overseen implementation and operation of trade compliance solutions in many, many countries throughout the Americas, Asia Pacific, and also Europe. Currently, Mr. Romano is employed at MIC Custom Solutions, which is a worldwide leading provider of global customs and trade compliance solutions. And what his company is doing and what his function is and how he can help you to understand the challenges from a supplier's perspective, that will be answered within the next 10 to 15 minutes by Gianluca. So a very warm welcome, Gianluca. Thanks for joining, and I'm glad you're here with us.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you to Mr. Valencia and Mr. Cervantes. So just very briefly on our company, we are a software company, as Thomas introduced very kindly. We are an Austrian-based company founded in Linz. We remain privately owned by the family of the original founders. We've grown over time organically, some 15% per year over the last 30 plus years, to now we're almost 400 employees in in all major continents. Briefly here, you see the countries that we support today with our software, allowing for self-filing, customs declarations, and related trade regulations throughout North America, South America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Specific to today, free trade agreements, we're talking about USMCA, but as everybody I believe is familiar, we have many free trade agreements with different rules. And our software today supports over 100 free trade agreements integrated into the core systems, the legacy systems of our customers across the globe. So let's speak a little bit about today with our new challenge beginning July 1st, as our colleagues introduced. And as Mr. Valencia shared with us, we are working now from the uniform regulations which were issued by the three parties in early June. From an automotive perspective, these regulations gave us some clarification on the rules of origin specific to the automotive industry. I say partial, some clarification, because there are still many open issues, many doubts, many clarifications required as we move forward. The rules, as Mario Valencia shared with us, have changed dramatically, both for the vehicle producers, the OEMs, the assemblers, as well as for their Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. We have in passenger and light truck vehicles a concept called supercore, which has core components of the vehicles required to come from the region. Mario spoke to us in some detail about steel and aluminum. That is a topic which is very much still under clarification. There's been expansion from the original scope of steel and aluminum certification from raw metals to now including automotive parts under Chapter 87. That is a big change both for the assemblers and down to the Tier 1 suppliers, which originally appeared to be exempt from this requirement. But we'll see in a moment, this will be front and center for our suppliers here in the US, in Canada, and Mexico. The labor value content is a very new concept and is being approached differently by different customers of ours. Different OEMs that we work with have different approaches to how they will certify the labor value content for their vehicles and how they will interact with their suppliers in that certification process. And lastly, we have a concept that's unique to automotive called the alternative staging regimes, where each OEM has the possibility to negotiate with the authorities based upon investment commitments for a transition period of up to 5 years for their vehicles, up to 100% of their vehicles, and we're seeing different results for different European, Asian, and Americas-based OEMs. So that will impact each supply chain. And lastly, we have introduced, it is unclear whether it's 6 or 12 months, a transition period which is specific to automotive companies in the automotive industry, both the assemblers and the suppliers, under which the US Customs has said they will not require supporting documentation before December 31st, and there might be some relaxation of enforcement into the Q1 and Q2 of 2021. At this point, it's not clear whether that same relaxation will apply for the Canadian colleagues or the SAT auditors in Mexico. So there's some uncertainty around that transition period as well, as we get very close to Thomas's earlier point to our date of effectivity. So automotive is a big topic. We are focused on one industry, but within automotive, we have 4 end uses with different rules of origin. We have rules of origin for passenger vehicle and light truck, which are one group. Heavy truck, the semi-trucks for Daimler, for Volvo, for Navistar, have separate rules. Buses and other vehicles are in a category 3 of other, and a 4th category of diesel vehicles and other non-passenger vehicles are included in a separate rules of origin. And we put here as 4 end uses plus 1. because there are rules of origin that are specific to the tariff classification of the parts and components, which will apply for non-production uses. So border crossing, if you are shipping from US to Canada, US to Mexico, you have to apply the component-specific rule of origin, and it appears that that will apply to the aftermarket as well. And we'll speak in a moment from the supplier's perspective of what that means when you are certifying your parts. Conceptually, one could have 5 certification calculations for one part. So, what is our situation today as we come into the end of June? Solicitation of suppliers has begun. We have OEMs soliciting tier 1s, we have tier 1 suppliers soliciting tier 2 suppliers, requesting information and documentation. Mario shared earlier, we have no official format today for this agreement. We don't have a certificate of origin format as we had officially under NAFTA. That has been proposed by the authorities as a benefit to the business, to the industry, but it creates its own complexities. Suppliers can expect to receive multiple solicitations from their customers. So one customer, one OEM, could send you, as a supplier, multiple requests. You could have, as we just saw, under each end use, you could have different requirements, different requests, different calculations. So if you are a supplier both to a heavy truck producer and to a passenger vehicle producer, you will have different rules of origin. Some of our customers are requesting the steel and aluminum content in a distinct and separate certification solicitation. So that could be a second request from the customer. Labor value content is being approached differently by different companies within the industry. In some cases, it's being solicited at the part number level. In other cases, we see it requested at the facility level. So I could say to a supplier, I want to know your labor value content for the factory in Monterrey, the factory in Michigan, the factory in Ontario, Canada, and ask for you to certify at the factory level. But then another solicitation from a different customer might give you the part numbers and ask you to certify at the part number level. Lastly, we're seeing accumulation value statements requested. These are for non-eligible parts. I cannot qualify my goods under the rule of origin, but I know that I add a certain amount of regional value content from the manufacturing in the NAFTA or in the USMCA region. So I might be requested to give a statement, a signed sworn statement that says, for example, I do not qualify under the rule of origin, but I can tell you that 35% of my content is from the region, and the vehicle producer can roll that into their calculations. So we can see multiple requests, even for each customer. To our earlier point, having no official format creates its own complexities. We will have different formats. Dr. Wolfgang may have a Volkswagen format that might be different from the format from General Motors, that might be different from the format from Daimler Trucks, that might be different from the format from Ford. So we do not have a consistent format between the different companies, even within the automotive industry. The Automotive Industry Action Group, the AIAG, is developing a standardized format, but it is not legally recognized or required. We see here what MIC has developed for our software. It looks in some ways quite similar to what we knew from NAFTA. This is the header information above the part number detail. But you see some additional fields. You see additional ability to certify based upon what your role is in the transaction. And in this case, we have also accumulation value as one of the required fields for some of our customers. But multiple formats will be received based upon your customers. What are the expectations of the automotive suppliers? Automotive goods for passenger vehicles and light trucks have a higher requirement, a tougher eligibility requirement than the same goods in heavy trucks or buses or diesel. So some customers may request from you, as we said, an end use certification. So I might say for this part, I need to know the eligibility, please, for both the passenger vehicle, rule of origin, and that for heavy trucks. The USTR, the US trade representative who negotiated this agreement between the parties from the US perspective, has stated that we can apply end-use certificates from light truck to passenger and passenger to light truck because the rules of origin are identical. So if you supply to General Motors for use in suburban as well as use in passenger vehicles, you can use that certificate for both. Suppliers can apply the end-use certificates for passenger and light truck to any production they have for heavy trucks, because those requirements, those rules of origin for passenger and light truck are more stringent, more tough, more difficult. This last slide that we prepared to share today is really to try to summarize expectations and maybe suggest an approach for suppliers within the automotive industry. We will see a large volume of requests across the industry. As we said, the solicitation processes have already begun for many of our OEM customers in the industry. How does a supplier approach the many, many part numbers that you will have requested by your suppliers or by your customers? Do you prioritize first those that are crossing the border to avoid duty payment on parts that are being shipped across borders for production? We have the concepts that Mario introduced of core parts and principal parts. If those are communicated to you from your OEM, those may receive priority. For some of the customers, the steel and aluminum statements will be a very high priority, maybe higher than the regional value content. Labor value content, as we said, can be its own request, its own solicitation, and that can be a very high priority for some of the customers. High value parts, those of the highest dollar or peso value, may take precedent over lower value parts. And lastly, specific to each OEM will be certain specific vehicle lines or models. Vehicle models might be on the cusp, might be difficult to certify, and therefore take priority. So in summary, as you look at a large volume of parts and a large workload for each supplier, give thought to what is the highest priority, because it's very difficult to address all these in the time period between now and July when we go live. So that, Thomas, I pass to you, and we can get into the OEM perspective perhaps.
Thank you very much, Gianluca. Yes, I think it's time to move along in the value chain, supplier's perspective on the one side, and I can see Dr. Demmelbauer-Ebner, who already switched on his camera. We are now continuing seeing the angle from an OEM perspective. And actually, I'm proud to announce that we invited the Chief Engineering Officer at Volkswagen USA, the Austrian Dr. Demmelbauer-Ebner, and who was kind enough to accept this invitation. Just 2 words about his career. Dr. Demmelbauer-Ebner started his career at university assistant before going actually into practice into automotive industry. His former positions include, among others, head of diesel engine development at SEAT in Spain, head of engine mechanics VR engines at Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, head of quality analysis and planning at Volkswagen AG Salzgitter, head of engine development at Audi Hungaria in Győr in Hungary, before then joining in 2018 Volkswagen Group of America. And we are listening now to a man who has almost gathered 26 years of OEM, world-renowned OEM experience. And I would also like to inform you that at the end, in the question and answer sections, we will have the honor to welcome Mr. Martin Ross, Senior Manager North America Purchasing, who will then be there for you as well to answer questions. With that having said, Mr. Dr. Demirba-Ebner, thank you for joining us today, and we're very exciting to listening of what you will tell us today, USMCA from a Volkswagen perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for your kind introduction and for the invitation to give our point of view to the USMCA. And also a very warm welcome from my side, located in Washington. So I want to start with a short introduction to give you an impression what we are doing here, Volkswagen is doing here in the market, which products we have. Then I'll talk about the USMCA requirements and our implementation strategy. And of course, at the end, I'm going to summarize these. So we are working in different regions. As you can see here, I'm head of engineering here for the North American region. I'm going to give you a short impression what we are doing here, engineering here directly in the region. You can see then in the green is South American region, blue is European region, and orange the Chinese region, and then rest of the world is gray marked here. So I'll go to the next slide. Here you see what is Volkswagen Group of America. You see I'd say the sexiest cars of the world, Lambo, Audi, Bentley and Bugatti are belonging to our group, and also here to the group of Volkswagen Group of America. And now I'll come to our products to give you a short impression here. Our flagship car, for sure, is the Atlas. It's a 7-seater car, very well received in the market, a huge SUV for the Americans, a mid-range SUV, but in Europe, it's by far too big. You won't find a parking garage with this car. And this year, we just launched a 5-seater version of this SUV. It's our Crossport. Also, we had the COVID crisis. The car launched very well. It's well received in the American market, and we are extremely happy about this car and the launch. Of course, we have also here our Passat for the American market. And these cars are made all in Chattanooga, and in a few years, I'd say in 2 years, we will also launch a battery electric car in the market here, fabricated here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we have a second huge factory here in Puebla in Mexico, where we are fabricating our Tiguan. It's a long wheel based Tiguan, a 7-seater version is available in this car. It sells very well. And the Jetta, that's the entry car for getting young people into our Volkswagen world. And here with this car, we have quite a good market share. And of course, Golf, there's nothing to say about. And also in Chattanooga, in a few months, I'd say at the end of the year, we want to launch a new SUV in Puebla. So now, to give you only a short impression of the products, I'm going to give you an impression what we are engineering here, that you know what will be your partner if you have interest to work with us. So we are engineering here mainly the huts. We are using the platform from Volkswagen cars, and then we put onto this platform where we have very good scale effects, of course. We are putting our Americanized huts, and the hut is everything you can look and see and feel. And we do the definition for the huts. We do the design, the development, and the testing. And in the end, of course, we certify it for the region. So if we come now to the entities, these are the engineering entities. Here you see that we are widely distributed from east to west, from north to south. I'm located here in Herndon, where the whole headquarter of the group board is located. And you see that we are using all the benefits of the different areas to be there where the most talents are for the specific works. Only to give you examples, here, for example, in Belmont, in the Silicon Valley, that's close to San Francisco, we are doing all the digitalization stuff. Then here design, for example, all the designers of the huge OEMs are located nearly in Los Angeles. So our design center for the region is also located here in Los Angeles. Then, of course, we have a proving ground here in Arizona, where we use the hot climate conditions. Then we have engineers located in Auburn Hills. They are doing mainly the certification, because there the EPA is located, and it's quite useful to be there with a certain amount of engineers. And here in Chattanooga and Mexico, where the big factories are, of course, there we also have a lot of engineers. For example, in Mexico, we have quite a huge engineering hub. We have more than 800 engineers located here. And of course, there we also have the beneficial labor costs. These guys, of course, much cheaper, and these are very potent and very good engineers, but of course, much cheaper, and they help us here than, for example, colleagues working in Belmont. No? So now let's come to the USMCA requirements. I think the main things have already been shown, so I'm going to go through briefly. You see here the discussion started with tariffs in the region of 25%. That was a huge risk, and for the European companies, and due to the Rule 232, that's it's a rule where if national risk is endangered, then this rule can be taken into account, and that was the high risk that Trump sees, the risk of the national security and changes, and therefore he wanted to. He discussed about customs fees of 25%. In China, there is additional the rule which concerns to the intellectual property. So these 25% for the Chinese products is not off the table, but our things are now with the USMCA so far off the table. So now let's come to the next slide. That summarizes a little bit of what the other colleagues have already talked about. So these are the things, four main things you have to fulfill USMCA. So for the whole passenger car, the local content has to be more than 75%. The core parts, the main parts of the car, there you also have to have a local content of more than 75%. For steel and aluminium, more than 70%. That's for us, to make it clear, very challenging, especially for steel. There we are we are still off our goals, and the labor value, so 40% of the labor value have to be come from the region with a amount of less than $16 paid per hour for the workers. Of course, here is the opportunity for compensation if you have R&D stuff and so on, and that of course helps in our case a little bit. So if you see on the next slide for the implementation and the strategy, very easily said, of course, we say for the main parts, the core parts, that's the engine, the transmission, the battery, the body, then the steering and the shafts. We want to fulfill, we have to fulfill it for 100%. Therefore, we have to localize all these things, and also, of course, the steel, as already mentioned, steel is challenging, and aluminium, we have to fulfill these 75%. So to give you an example of things we are already on the way to localize it. For example, we are localizing now the fabrication of the cylinder blocks with the high aluminium content here in Georgia. We will localize the transmission from Japan to Georgia. We do the battery manufacturing. We will do it in Tennessee, in Chattanooga. Then we moved parts, the engine, for example, from Germany to Silao, Mexico, and also from Austria. We are already moving the differential gear and the power takeoff unit also to Mexico. So these are some examples, and of course there will be much more examples for the future. So I'll come to the conclusion. We also already said, for us it's 100% clear we want to comply with the USMCA requirements. Therefore, we need to strengthen the local supplier base, and therefore we have a very clear localization strategy. For you as suppliers are, of course, a lot of opportunities. The market is completely changing now, and that's a huge opportunity to participate on these changing environment. Of course, it's also very important in the today's world to strengthen the global footprint, and and would be great to have local business with us. So as a conclusion, these are the main pillars we are in, and what you also have to think about if you are heading in this direction. The first step was we evaluated and proposed alternative plans, of course, to avoid new tariffs and settled up contingency plans. So we established a lot of cross-functional teams to analyze and to react to impacts on our business. And this is something, of course, everyone has to do who goes in this direction. And what's very, very important, you have to have a very deep understanding of all your materials origin, of the USMCA rules, of all the tariffs and shift models, etc. And be well prepared to support data requests for material origins and labor contents. So that's a very brief overview of USMCA from our side. So thanks for your attention, and I'll handle back to Thomas, and hopefully we have now an intense discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and your contribution. Once again, thank you also for keeping the timeline. It's so hard to compactly present these topics alongside the value chain, but I hope we gave the audience an overview of the most important issues there are in the USMCA, in times of USMCA right now. Gentlemen, I would like to ask you to switch on your cameras now, as we're now entering the question and answer section. In the meantime, as you can imagine, we have received a couple of questions, and I would like to summarize them and read them out loud. And I would like to start maybe with a question referring to the legal background of USMCA. I think there are still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of common misunderstandings out there. And the first question would be addressed to Mr. Cervantes and Mr. Valencia. I would like to sum up two questions which we received, which are the following. Is USMCA sort of directed to or focusing on automotive only, or did rules for other and percentages for other industries changed as well? An example given, that would be a second question. What happens, for example, if an Austrian company produces, for example, molded parts with steel or aluminum inserts? Would that restrict the company itself as well, or what kind of implications does this constellation have?
Right. Thank you, Thomas. Perhaps I can begin with this issue, and then, of course, pass it on to Mario. USMCA is not only addressing automotive, although it might appear that way, you know, from what you can see on the press and all the rest. There are other industries that, of course, have rules of origin, new rules of origin, such as textile, electronics, and some others. So it's all encompassing. It's much broader than the auto industry. But of course, auto industry being such an important industry for North America, it has a very specific impact on this. Mario, I don't know if you'd like to address the rest as well.
Sure, thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you, Thomas, for the question. Yes, as Juan Pablo was mentioning, definitely the focus has been on the auto industry because of how much the value content increased in the new treaty, but it definitely is not oriented only to that industry. Actually, one of the really hot topics during the negotiation was the textile industry and some agricultural products, because the US wanted to started a discussion again on let's go back to the original tariffs and then start lowering down like it happened with NAFTA. So one of the big success by Canada and Mexico was to say no, free trade, it's already there, let's start there and then maybe renegotiate some rules of origin. So from there, moving to the auto industry, so some textiles and some chemical products was seen as a win for Canada and Mexico, because it just focused on specific rules of origin rather than all of them. But no, it definitely doesn't encompass only auto industry. And regarding your second question, Thomas, I think that maybe Gianluca and Dr. Wolfgang also could have some comments on that, but I do believe that if you are part of the auto industry chain and you are using aluminum or steel, you will definitely be affected by the rule of origin content, because you want, I'm assuming that this question is oriented as, I will add that auto part to a finished product that will end up going to the US or Canada. So if you are incorporating your product into the value chain of the auto mobile that will go to Canada or the US, the aluminum and steel rule of origin content will definitely affect your product if you are including it to be part of a final good that is going to the US or Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. To be a little bit more precise, we're talking about the battery lid. So we have, in fact, a plastic molded part with an aluminum insert. And maybe Gianluca, do you have any remarks on that? Can you assess that from your supplier's perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. To Mario's point, we need to look at the rule of origin specific to the tariff classification of these components that you're describing. So if these are classified as automotive parts under Chapter 8708, 8708-29, or 8708-99, you may be requested for a certificate of steel or aluminum content. If, on the other hand, that cover that you described, Thomas, is classified as a part of the battery, then it may have a different rule of origin outside of the Chapter 87 that applies to automobiles and automotive parts. So to Dr. Wolfgang's point, you need to know your materials, your goods, your parts, your components, and you need to then understand the rule of origin specific to those, because it's not simply across the entire automotive industry, it's specific to each classification under the tariff. So some deeper investigation will be required, but the short answer is maybe. Yes, maybe.
Thank you very much for this explanation. Mr. Demmelbauer-Ebner, I could have anticipated this question already, which is coming right now. You listed a couple of components and parts, what VW is sourcing now to, or aiming for localization. But can you maybe explain a little bit how, like, if you can, what supplier technology VW is currently looking for, and how Austrian enterprises might have good chances to apply with Volkswagen as a supplier, if they're, for example, already here and they have a plant in Mexico, for example?
Yeah, I think how you get the Volkswagen supplier, it's a very clear way. I think where there you have to qualify beforehand. This is the same rules than anywhere, and rules and standards than anywhere in the Volkswagen world. And as soon as you are qualified as a Volkswagen supplier, then you can, of course, you go in contact with us, with our purchasing guys, and then it's, of course, at the end also a question of money, how good you are here in the competition. And then at the end, if you are qualified to work with us, then we engineering guys come into the game. We do then the work with you for engineering the right, let's say, design performance of the parts. And then at the end, we localize the parts together. That means we are completely in, and we test your parts that they at the end are fulfilling our standard regulations of the Volkswagen Group. That's in a very, very rough way, a long story short. No? I hope that answers the question. No? But if someone is who's interested here in all the details, it's easy, especially for Martin, who's also here part of the presentation, to give here a very clear form how to do it. No?
So applying with Volkswagen in a nutshell, and if I understood you correctly, that's Mr. Martin Ross, who can, I think, hear us. I'm not sure if he's with us on his phone. He would be the person to address this issue directly, if that's correct.
100%. Or our purchasing departments, they are the first, I'd say, the front office for all the interaction with us. No?
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So a shout out to all the companies, ideally the companies who actually invested in North America. If you are interested to get in touch with the purchasing department from Volkswagen, you can do that through our through directing an email to us, and we will further distribute this communication to the right persons. Well, Mr. Cervantes and Mr. Valencia, maybe I can get back to the legal framework of USMCA. The question is also, okay, there are clear regulations, or more or less clear regulations, depending on how precisely you look at the issue. But what happens if you don't meet the requirements? For example, the rules of origin in the automotive industry, or maybe in any other industry. What precisely happens there, and what do Austrian exporters in North America, for example, have to fear, for example, from Mexico to the US? What consequences do they have to fear?
Well, there's certainly a challenging issue that I think many suppliers, of course, may fear could happen to them. What have we seen, Mario? What would be your recommendation to make sure that they do meet all the necessary requirements, and of course, if they don't?
Well, to address maybe first the question that was posted by Thomas, I think I will divide it in two main aspects. The first one is that you need to be aware that whether, even though there is now an accumulation of origin criteria, which will allow actually parts that are coming from countries that Mexico has also another free trade agreement could get involved into this accumulation of origin rule in order to be subject to the USMCA preferences. The main criteria in Mexico, well, in the NAFTA and now in the USMCA, has always been that if you are not coming from the region, you will first have to pay taxes, the import taxes in your country when you're incorporated into a product that is going to the US or Canada if you're manufacturing in Mexico. So there's always it's always going to come into play the fact that if your product is not a USMCA product, you might have to pay taxes nonetheless when you are incorporated into a finished product that is coming to the US or Canada. So this accumulation of origin rule might help you avoiding that. So first, you might have to pay taxes on your specific product, but at the end, if you don't meet the full rules of origin criteria for the final product coming to the US or Canada, then you will have to pay the tariff, the WTO tariff that it's already established there, that is basically 2.5% if you are talking about the whole car. So that I think that to this point, it is important to consider what my colleague Gianluca was saying, which is first you need to identify the specific product and see how it plays out when it's coming to Mexico and whether it is already subject to a preferential tariff through another free trade agreement. Like, for example, if it's coming from Austria, it will likely be subject to the EU-Mexico free trade agreement preferences. So maybe you won't be really affected all the way as the part, but only if the full auto is not complying with the USMCA rules of origin. And then maybe your auto part will be okay, and it's only the whole automobile that is coming to the US or Canada that will be subject to a tariff of 2.5%. So, but in that regard, it's also important, and I don't know if Dr. Wolfgang has the same idea, but there are some industries that are actually assessing whether it's cheaper to pay the 2.5% than adjusting the whole chain to actually comply with the rule of origin. So it's coming to that point. So it's not only what happens if I don't, if that 2.5% that it's going to be applied to the automobile is going to be affecting me or not. It's sometimes that might be cheaper than adjusting all of my value chain to actually comply with the rule of origin. So, I mean, but in summarizing the answer, we could say depending on the rule of origin to that particular part, it will have to pay taxes as the part. But if it's coming from a country that Mexico already has a free trade agreement with, as it could be the EU, then maybe no taxes will have to be paid. And if the whole automobile it's the one that is not complying with the rule of origin, then it will be 2.5 over the value, the finished, the final value of the automobile. But again, it depends on how it all plays out and how it will accumulate.
Thank you very much. So summing it up, there are no restrictions like which is influencing your production, but if you're not meeting the rule of origin requirements, for example, you are not qualified for free trade within North America, so you have to pay the tax or the tariff which is being implemented. And I think it's also important to say that the tariffs are varying depending on the product itself and the export good, right? Good.
Yes, that is correct. The 2.5 that I was referring to, it's only for the whole automobile. But if it's the auto part, yeah, the tariff will depend or vary depending on the tariff classification applicable to that specific group.
Super. Gianluca, we just heard the scenario presented by Mr. Valencia that some companies will make the calculations. Does it, let's call it like this, pay off or does not pay off to actually meet the requirements? How do you see supplier industry in North America changing? Will there be an increase of localization, obviously, or maybe not, surprisingly? Or do you think, is there a trend towards taking the risk of paying 2.5% in the automotive sector, for example, and seeing what will bring the future? How would you assess this?
Excellent question. So I think we have a number of things going here, and we saw some of this in Dr. Wolfgang's slides about the threat of potential 232 duties on the automotive industry. And then we saw also, I think it was in Juan Pablo's slide, the side letters that are in place in between Mexico, US, and Canada, US, for those 232 duties. So many companies, or some companies, to Mario's point, are saying the requirements are too high. I will not play the game. I will not participate. I'll pay the duties and keep my supply chain the way it is. The question then is, if there are so many companies that decide not to participate and not to follow the rules of origin and simply to pay the duties, what happens next? Because I don't think you see the USTR, for example, stopping the pressure on the automotive industry if the current rules of origin are not enough incentive for them to participate. So the 232 duties on the overall automotive industry, not just Europe, but Europe, Asia, outside of the region, may be the lever, may be the leverage that USTR uses in the future to bring more of the companies into the game, to the table. That's just a conjecture, but we see the preparation of those tools that if 2.5% is not a high enough incentive, that maybe the rules get changed. Right. Dr. Wolfgang, please feel free to.
Yeah. So when we know that the presidential elections are about to happen soon, and that always gives room for political decisions as well, right? So I think relying on the fact that the tariffs stay with 2.5% is maybe not a safe bet. Dr. Demirba-Ebner, maybe you can say a few remarks or address that topic also from.
Nothing to add, only to make an example. If you have, for example, a Jetta, which is already localized here by most components in the region, then it's easy to do the rest of the works. But on the other hand, if you have cars which are not fabricated in the region, and there are a lot of our cars which are brought to the region, there, of course, it's a completely different game than, especially if you have low volume cars. Of course, you can easily imagine then it makes no sense to settle up completely new factories for low volume cars. So you have to see it, as Mario and Gianluca already mentioned, differently. And at the end of the day, everything is a business case, so it has to stay a business case, yeah.
And maybe a follow-up question, because this question was also asked by the audience. How will the rules of origin rule, for example, be assessed and evaluated? For example, by Volkswagen, maybe just we can just continue with you, Mr. Demmelbauer-Ebner. How will you assess or evaluate the local content?
There are lots of purchasing guides behind these huge Excel lists or huge sheets to evaluate it. Perhaps Martin Ross, who's extremely in all these things. Can you switch him over the microphone? Or Martin, are you able to answer this question in a little bit of more of detail than I did it?
No, sorry. Hey, it's Marty Ross. I was able to connect by audio. So just to add to what Dr. Demmelbauer mentioned just a moment ago, is he's exactly right. So in our sourcing processes for new products, our buyers will engage directly with our suppliers to understand their estimated local content at the time of the start of production. So that means all the way down to the raw material level of where that material is coming from, whether it's steel, aluminum, copper, for example, and then also what the content of local production is, right? So that we can have an idea, will we be in a position to achieve all these rules of origin? Then, of course, our customs colleagues will follow that up with the actual certificates and evidence that the parts are indeed meeting the requirement. But that really starts with the purchasing process to understand the origin of all those materials, and will we be in a position to make a strategic decision to have a local part there. So exactly correct.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy you managed to join.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I can pass back the ball to Gianluca. So can you sum up also for the supply industry that the evaluation and the proving process goes back in the value chain, meaning that the OEM is finally responsible for the rule of origin aspect, but so are tier 1 and tier 2 companies, for example?
Certainly, Thomas. To Marty's point, after the sourcing has already been planned and approved, then there is this legal representation that's requested by the OEM through the supply chain down to tier 1 and maybe to tier 2 and even further in the supply chain to determine whether those parts truly qualify. And to Mario's earlier point, the certification is based upon evidence. You have to be able to evidence that you comply with that rule of origin. And it's not only that I can tell Marty today that I comply with it. It's 3 years from now, it's 4 years from now. We have a 5-year statute of limitations under customs law in the US and similar for Canada and Mexico. And so it's not only what I can tell Marty today about a part, it's what I can prove to the auditors in 3 years and 4 years and even up to 5 years. I have to have that audit trail and documentation. I have to have the systems and the data to be able to show that I qualified. And so that qualification is not only to the customer, say Volkswagen, but also to the authorities. So you're building your audit trail for all of these different reviews or different investigations, and you need to have it in a clear and available. So if Gianluca is on vacation or is gone, who is going to be able to tell Volkswagen or tell the authorities or tell the Mexican SAT why we believed on July 1st that qualified? So it's a very big burden throughout the industry in terms of audit trail, evidence, and documentation.
Thank you very much. I would like to come to the end of this section by closing with rather general questions. We have received many technical questions, and I would ask you for your understanding that we're addressing those very technical individual requests after the webinar in written form, or we can organize a phone call as well to clarify the issues. But maybe a last question to Mr. Cervantes and Mr. Valencia. It's a bit unclear how calculations are being done, for example, by the body of customs. For example, when we talk about assemblers, they're partly producing here, they're partly just assembling. How will calculations be assessed from US Customs, for example? Do you have insights into that topic?
Well, Thomas, that's a really important and unanswered question, and it has been like that since SAT started auditing or reviewing these issues. But I think that the way of doing it is as Gianluca was describing. SAT doesn't have, has never have, and I don't think will have in the future, especially because of how, I mean, it's sad, but how much we are losing the level of specialization and technical knowledge that the new officers that are member or that are integrated into SAT have of the rules of origin. So it is complicated for the producers, it is complicated for the industry, so for them it's going to be double as complicated. So I do believe that the way of doing it will be, we need to be sure that we have all of the evidence and the trail that Gianluca was referring to prove that we do comply with the rule of origin. If we're able to show and convince them that we are complying with the rule of origin, they will believe it, but I don't think they are gonna have a map or a guideline to follow as to whether I am actually complying or following all of the evidence that I need to follow. I do believe that it's gonna fall on the producers and the auto industry and the value chain to have the evidence, the trail of documents to sit down with SAT and prove that they actually comply. That's the way we've been doing it. We are really familiar. We have handled a lot of origin review from Mexico to the US producers or exporters. And the way we've been doing is to showing number by number, document by document that we comply with rules of origin, rather than the SAT saying, well, if you are in the textile industry, this is the list that I need you to show me. If you're in the auto industry, this is the guideline that I'm going to follow. They basically sit down and they are like, convinced me that you actually comply with the rule of origin. So I do believe that we are going to be looking into that same way of work by the customs authority in Mexico. And I don't see them having a clear understanding on how we are actually going to comply with the rules of origin if we don't show them how, especially because now, and I do believe that we have touched on this, but maybe not with the relevance that it has, but now all of the technology that goes into a car, it's going to play into whether I am complying with the rule of origin or not. So imagine having to explain how this chip that goes into the computer of the car adds this much value to the final value of the car. So for them, it's going to be really complicated. So I do believe that it's going to be on us to actually set down the guideline or the map that they need to follow to actually be convinced that we comply with the rule of origin.
Right. Right. Thank you very much. So summing up the topic, it's quite complicated right now, and I think a case-by-case assessment is necessary. So I'm happy to announce once again that our experts will be available for you after this webinar as well to clarify individual issues. But ladies and gentlemen, I ask you for understanding that we now reached or actually exceeded our time limit for today's webinar. Most of our speakers have other appointments as well, as we are in America and just started the day. So I would like to give or say a big thank you to Mr. Cervantes, Mr. Valencia from Galicia Abogados, to Mr. Gianluca Romano from MIG Custom Solutions, and also to Dr. Demelbauer-Ebner and Mr. Ross from Volkswagen USA for taking your time and providing us a good insight on this topic, and also being present for the question and answer section. Before ending the webinar, I would just like to make 2 remarks on shortly upcoming events by our organization. On June 30th, next week, Sunday, not Sunday, but it will be on Tuesday, the biggest export and internationalization event in Austria will be taking place online for the first time this year. This event is called Exporttag, and all members of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber will have the possibility to join free of cost and book individual meetings and coaching with over 70 trade commissioners from all parts of the world. So that's an online B2B, or not B2B, but an online meeting where you can book your coachings if you're interested in sort of reviving your export business. On July 2nd, though, you should mark that date in your calendar if you enjoyed today's webinar, and if you're interested also in US trade, because our colleagues from Washington, Advantage Austria Washington, are organizing a webcast overviewing US trade policies and the existing tariffs, together with Mrs. Nicole Bevans-Collins from Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. So don't miss out on that. You should see the registration link in the chat window. If you're interested to sign up for one of these events, then please do so by clicking on the links provided in the chat window. So with that having said, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, thank you very much for your participation and contribution. To my experts, thank you very much for taking your time and taking a lot of time for explaining your views on USMCA. We will be very curious what's happening in the upcoming weeks and months, because I think that will clarify or will lift the cloud of uncertainty a little bit. And we keep on following this this issue, and we'll be happy to be available for our audience, of course, in Austria. So I wish you all the best. I hope this webinar was informative for you. And with that having said, I wish you all a good evening to all the participants from Europe, and a good start into the day or into the second half of the day if we have viewers from USA, Canada, or Mexico here as well, which I do think so. But to all of you, in any case, have a successful week, and in these times, please stay healthy. Thank you very much, and hope to talk to you soon or see you soon. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a nice one.